All right, class, Essay 2 is fast approaching. So I want to go ahead and go over some tips that you may find useful for Essay 2. Give me 1 second. There we go. All right. So the biggest cause of point deduction for Essay 1 was bad MLA formatting. Now, if you recall the rubric, MLA formatting is 20% of the final grade. I know it's painstaking and obnoxious. Nobody thinks that more than I do, but it's still something that we have to observe. So make sure that you're not losing points for silly little formatting mistakes. If you want to double check your MLA formatting, you're going to want to check the quick guide in the Writing Resources folder on Blackboard. Also, you can use the Purdue OWL. OWL stands for Online Writing Lab. A quick Google search of Purdue OWL will produce the website. It's a very useful tool. It has style guides not only for MLA, but also for APA and Chicago style, which you may encounter in your other classes. Okay, do not include a title page or paragraph titles. Some MLA essays do have these things, but I do not require them, and I think they often detract from the flow of the essay. So no need to include that stuff. We just need, on the front page, we need a header and a heading and a title, but that goes right above the first paragraph. Citing the source does not simply mean copying and pasting the citation information at the end of the essay. Students seem to think that if they just give me the citation, if they put a title that says works cited and they copy and paste some citation information, that means they cited the source. You need to use parenthetical citations throughout the essay. Now, the parenthetical citations show me that this material that you've used from a source can be found at this location. Most parenthetical citations include the last name of the author and the page or pages that the cited material can be located on. So I have an example here of a parenthetical citation that would come after a quote or after a paraphrase of information from another source. And it says Dinkley 17. Okay, so that means if I go to your works cited page and I find the source from Mr. Elmer Dinkley here, and I go to page 17, I'll be able to find that quote. However, if this information, meaning the author's last name, is not available for your source, you must use the next available citation information. So they go in a list. That list is given to you on the quick guide in Blackboard. Whatever you can find at the start of the list, that's the information that you include in the parentheses. Most of the time, that's going to be author's last name and page number, assuming that there is a page number. Sometimes if you use a source online, there won't be one. However, most of the sources that you're going to be using are scholarly articles from Galileo, which means that they will usually have a page range to them. Make sure you check the Purdue OWL or the MLA quick guide for that stuff. Another thing, using direct quotes with quotation marks from sources is always preferable to paraphrasing. I know it can be painstaking to type things out exactly as they appear on the source, but you run the risk of changing what is said when you paraphrase, and sometimes when you paraphrase, I can't tell what's coming from you or what's coming from the source. So the quotation marks, they get rid of that problem, right? It's just a good rule of thumb. The next one, always have a lead-in statement for quotes. I always say no alien landings, right? If the quote just drops out of the sky and I don't know where it came from, it's like an alien landing in a cornfield. So what we need is a lead-in statement. Anything like according to one scholar, as one expert suggests, in one article or something like that. Any sort of lead-in which lets me know, hey, this is coming from this type of source or from an expert or whatever. So here's my example. According to one scholar, quote, if you gaze long into an abyss, the abyss gazes also into you, close quote. I'm being a little funny with my quotes here, folks. So then we have the citation Dinkley 27, which means that if I go to the source by Elmer Dinkley and I go to page 27, I'm going to find the quote, if you gaze long into an abyss, the abyss gazes also into you. So that's how you do that. That's how you have that lead-in statement, and that's how you situate your quotes. Notice that the period for the quote goes after the parentheses. The period for the sentence. You would think it would go here after you, but actually it goes after the citation. So make sure that you're not putting two periods or that you're putting the period in the wrong place, because even though that stuff is nitpicky, it does matter. Okay, next thing. Make sure all your sources pass the credibility test. Galileo is your friend, because in Galileo you can check peer review, you can check scholarly sources, you can select what kind of sources you get, so you can pick from articles and stuff and full text. If you're just going based on the internet, there may be something that looks legit and it's really not. You've got to go through that crap acronym, right? Currency, relevancy, authority, authenticity, and purpose, right? Each one of those letters in the acronym corresponds with an attribute that you're supposed to be looking for the source. And if you can tick all of those boxes, it means it's a good source and it's good to go. The only thing I would say is that currency, you want to stay fairly current, but the problem with some of these databases is that the sources have already run their course in their publications before they reach the database, so there can be somewhat of a time delay. So I'm a little bit more lenient about that than I probably should be. But try to get the sources as current as you possibly can. The further back you go in time, the greater the risk that you will say something incorrect is. The next one is do not use the first person at all for argumentative, persuasive, or exemplification writing. So no need to reference yourself, I, me, my, that sort of thing. And I've talked about why that is. Part of it is that you don't have the expertise to self-reference like that. Saying I think this implies that you have some sort of credibility in that area, and you want to just try to remove that. The other thing is it can kind of invite bias. It can invite you to give opinions instead of basing things in facts. So be very careful about using I. It's just a good rule of thumb to get out of the habit. There's always a way to say what you want to say without using the first person. The next one is do not break the fourth wall. Okay, what I mean by that is don't reference the essay within the essay, or mention the fact that you are writing an essay, or reference to previous paragraphs or sentences, like in the previous sentence or in the previous paragraph. And we call that breaking the fourth wall, which is a term that comes from theater. If you're ever watching a play and one of the characters turns to the audience and speaks to them as though he were candidly talking to them, that's called breaking the fourth wall. We see it in films sometimes, like Deadpool. Deadpool's always turning to you and talking. So don't do that. Don't reference the fact that you're writing an essay or mention previous parts of the essay. I know that you're writing an essay because I'm reading it, so I don't need you to say it. And it's just awkward. It creates like an awkward meta aspect to the writing that's not really desirable. The next one is put forth an argument as opposed to simply listing the findings from your research. This is an argumentative essay. It is not a research paper. Okay, so you're not just going through Galileo and compiling information on a certain topic. You are putting forth an argument about that topic. If you'll recall, I should have put this on this list, but I forgot to. The formula for the claims is problem, solution, so what. So you identify the problem, you offer the solutions, and you give the so what factor, or you explain why this matters or why we should care about this. And that's a good way to make sure that your argument sticks to the proper structure. And so putting forth an argument is important, because if you just list findings, it's a research paper. That's not what we're after. I'm trying to teach you how to put forth an argument and to defend it. Use the evidence to defend the argument. Don't just provide the evidence as the assignment itself, right? Also, remember the formula for intro paragraphs that applies to this essay too. Hook, line, and sinker, okay? The hook is the attention getter. You want to start with a really strong way to grab your reader's attention. Then the line section, that's going to be contextual information, anything that we need to know so that the thesis statement makes sense. And then, of course, the sinker is the thesis statement. So if you follow this formula for intro paragraphs, you will have all of the necessary components. Remember to start body paragraphs with a strong topic sentence claim. Follow up that claim with evidence from a credible source or sources, and follow up that evidence with analysis in your own words, okay? So that's basically the formula for the body paragraphs. Now the claims, the topic sentence claims, they can follow that same formula, problem, solution, so what. We just go from the thesis being like the big picture argument, and then the topic sentences being like focused on specific areas, okay? You can follow the same formula if you like. As long as you're putting forth a claim, you're in good shape, right? You're putting forth an argument, then you're defending the argument, and then you're explaining the argument. And that brings me to the next one, which I always say the example, explain the bloody knife, kind of a disturbing example. But if you'll recall, I say you walk into a room and there's a bloody knife on the table. What happens? When I ask this question in class, sometimes students go, well, someone got stabbed. It's like, well, maybe they did. But there could be actually several reasons that there could be a bloody knife. Like, it could be that I was whittling and cut myself. It could be that it's a prop for the drama club. It could be that it's not actually blood at all, but it's borscht or something, right? So, until you explain, hey, this knife is bloody because I cut myself by accident, don't be alarmed, the the observer doesn't really know what to think. Now, I think it's safe to assume that if you see a bloody knife on the table, you should run away. But you don't necessarily know what happened just based on that information. So always include analysis after the evidence that you provide. Do not assume that the reader will see what you see in the evidence, right? Lead them to the conclusion, the specific conclusion that you want them to draw, because two people looking at a bloody knife might not draw the same conclusion, right? The next one is avoid colloquial or figurative speech. This includes slang. If you use jargon, which is like words that are specific to a niche subject, make sure you define the jargon. Don't just assume that I know what it is, because a lot of this stuff I really don't have the level of awareness of it that I should. Don't use colloquial speech, meaning speech of like everyday terminology, stuff that you would say just in casual conversation. Don't use like cliches, like you can lead a horse to water, that kind of thing. Be very, very formal, and don't use figurative speech like the professor's anger was like a burning fire that could not be extinguished, right? We know what you mean by that, but actually the figurative language there, it makes the meaning a little bit ambiguous, right? Just say what you mean. Say that I was really mad. That's all they need to know, right? The next one is avoid wordiness. I know there's a word count. You guys are trying to get to that 950, 1,000 words, but having too many words is just as bad as having too few. So you really want to try to find that nice sort of middle ground of having just the right amount of words to say what it is that you need to say, right? Okay, let's see. The next thing, avoid passive voice where possible. I discussed passive voice in a previous lecture, and you can look up some information on it on the Purdue OWL if you don't recall those lectures, or if you are still a little bit confused about that. They have some exercises and they define it very well, so just try to avoid it. The passive voice is where the subject of the sentence is not performing the action in question. So you want to get, so the example, just one example would be, the dog bit the boy is active voice because the subject dog is performing the action bit, but the boy was bitten by the dog is passive voice, whereas the subject dog is not performing the action in the sentence. So that means usually passive voice is more wordy and less direct. So it's not something that you want to do. That's just a small thing, but if you really want to get the awesome grade on Essay 2, that's the kind of stuff you'll be looking at. Vary the words and phrases that you use and avoid saying the same things over and over. If you got a comment on your first essay that said like word variance, that means that you're using the same words over and over, sometimes in the same sentence. And even though you don't really hear that necessarily, I assure you that your reader does, so it's something that you want to avoid. Also, avoid saying in conclusion when you get to your conclusion. People just do it reflexively, but it's super overused. You don't need to announce the conclusion. The conclusion should announce itself by attaining the tone of closure, right? It should be obvious. It's like when you're watching a speech and you can tell somebody's wrapping up, right? Okay, avoid repeating yourself in the conclusion. Remember, my personal preference as an instructor is that you don't say, and in conclusion, here's everything I already said in 3 pages. Why do you do that, right? Because your high school teacher told you to. The logic, I think, is that repeating like makes the argument stick in your reader's mind there at the end, but I just spent 3 pages reading your argument, so I don't really buy that much. I think it can be repetitive and just kind of, in a way it's kind of lazy. You just say, all right, what did I say already? Okay, list it out, and then we're done. So you just want to try to address open-ended questions, speculations, anything to avoid repeating yourself, okay? Least important, most difficult. That's what I say about the conclusion, so remember that. Avoid bias in your tone, especially since this is an argumentative essay. I know people can have strong opinions about certain subjects. So even though you may have those strong opinions, try to avoid bias in your tone. Try to operate in good faith, as we said. That means that you're very careful to not seem as though you're being closed off to the idea that you might be wrong, because what if you are, right? It's always possible. Avoid speculation. Focus on what you can prove with sources and information that you can find in your research. Speculation, sometimes is logical, but sometimes it isn't, and it has no basis, so you have to be really careful about that. Include more of your own voice than the voices of scholars or sources. You're going to be using scholars and sources. But you don't want to have like huge swaths of other people's work in your essay to try to get to that 1,000-word count, because if I don't see you working with these ideas and explaining them in your own terms and putting forth well-structured arguments, then you're not really doing the assignment, right? So don't try to include so much information from sources that you don't do enough work in the essay yourself. You can weigh opposing arguments, but do not bifurcate your stance, which what I mean by that is don't take two positions at the same time. Even if you can see it both ways, and sometimes we can, right? It really depends on what angle you come at certain subjects, but just pick one for the sake of remaining consistent, right? Because when you take two positions, sometimes it makes you seem unsure, and it's like, well, why did I read an essay if you're going to tell me that you don't know what side is right, right? So make sure you pick one. And then the final thing is be direct and specific, especially with the thesis and topics and its claims. There are many reasons why we should do this. Okay, what are those many reasons, right? Tell me specifically. You got to get out of the habit of beating around the bush, right? Be direct, be specific, use specific terminology, and make sure that you hone in on exactly what it is that you want to say, because that's how your essay is going to really shine. Okay, there's other stuff probably, but those are the main things. Also, make sure you edit your essay, make sure that you read over it, read it aloud if it helps, get someone else to read it. These can all be helpful stuff. And last thing I want to say, avoid plagiarism, guys. Remember, if you use anything from an outside source, it has to be cited, and it has to be on that works cited page, and you should probably use quotation marks instead of paraphrasing. And if there is any circumstance where that is not the case, it is my duty as an instructor to level the penalties against you for academic dishonesty. So you really need to be careful about that. Unfortunately, on the first essay, across the board in all of my classes, I had more cases of this time around than I usually see. So I really want to reiterate that it's very important you do not plagiarize, because the consequences are quite severe. So best to avoid it and just get the work done honestly. Okay, so if you have any questions for me whatsoever, you know how to reach me by my email address. Other than that, I hope you have a wonderful afternoon, and I will see you again soon.